Part 1. The Galactic Concordat had kept peace for 11,000 years. This was not a small number. It was longer than any empire in human history. It was longer than recorded human civilization itself. 17 different species, spread across 1,000 star systems, had learned to live together without war. They traded. They talked. They solved problems with words and agreements. Violence was something they read about in old history files. A strange behavior from primitive times when creatures still killed each other over resources. The Concordat worked because its members had evolved past conflict, though with their crystalline bodies and mathematical minds, had not fought a war in 50,000 years. The soft-bodied beings who communicated through color changes found the very concept of physical combat disturbing. The ancient and slow-moving had achieved enlightenment before most species had developed fire. Together, these civilizations had built something beautiful, a galaxy of cooperation. A system where no one needed to fear. Then they arrived. They came from beyond the charted regions, from a cluster of stars the Concordat had never explored. Their ships were black and angular, built for one purpose: war. 800 vessels dropped out of faster-than-light travel near the colony world of Seven, a peaceful agricultural planet inhabited by 300,000 Concordat citizens. They were six-limbed creatures with hard shells and compound eyes. They had unified their home cluster through conquest. Every species they encountered they either enslaved or destroyed. This was their way. This was all they knew, and now they wanted new territory. Their message was simple: surrender everything, accept permanent servitude, or die. The governor of Seven sent an urgent transmission to the Concordat Council. Within hours, the 17 member species had gathered in emergency session. They debated for 3 days. Some argued for negotiation. Surely they could be reasoned with. Perhaps they simply did not understand that civilized beings did not behave this way. Others suggested offering tribute, giving the resources in exchange for peace. A few voices, quiet and afraid, whispered about surrender. Maybe serving would be better than dying. No one suggested fighting. The Concordat had no military. Their ships were built for exploration and trade, not combat. They had no weapons beyond ceremonial relics stored in museums. For 11,000 years, they had not needed such things. The council decided to send Ambassador Saren. She was the finest diplomat they had ever produced. For 200 years, she had resolved disputes between species, calmed tensions, found solutions where none seemed to exist. If anyone could reach it would be her. Her ship approached the fleet under a flag of peace. She broadcast messages of friendship. She offered to discuss terms. She explained that the Concordat wished only to understand their new neighbors and find a way to coexist. They captured her vessel within minutes. They executed Saren on the command deck of their flagship. They made her kneel. They made her beg. Then they killed her slowly while recording everything. They broadcast the footage across all frequencies, making sure every Concordat world could see. The message was clear: there would be no negotiation. There would be no peace. There would only be conquest. Panic spread through the Concordat like a disease. Species that had lived without fear suddenly remembered what fear felt like. Emergency sessions continued, but now the debates had a different tone. How could they flee? Where could they hide? Some systems began evacuating immediately, loading citizens onto transport ships and heading deeper into the galaxy. Others simply waited, frozen by terror, unable to process what was happening. The fleet began moving toward the inner worlds. It was during the 5th day of emergency sessions that Delegate Eth of the raised a proposal no one wanted to hear. There was one species the Concordat had deliberately excluded from membership. A young species, barely 200 years into space travel. A species that had been rejected because they were considered too primitive, too violent, too dangerous. The humans. The chamber fell silent. Every delegate knew about the humans. They occupied a small region of space near the galactic rim. They had applied for Concordat membership 3 times, and 3 times they had been. The official reason was insufficient cultural development. The real reason was simpler. The humans scared them. Humanity had done something no other known species had done. They had waged industrial war against their own kind. They had built weapons capable of destroying entire cities. They had killed millions of their own people in conflicts over land, resources, and ideas. Even now, after achieving space travel, they maintained military forces. They built warships. They trained soldiers. They prepared for violence as if it were inevitable. The Concordat had wanted nothing to do with such creatures. Better to keep them isolated, contained in their little corner of space, until they eventually grew past their violent phase, if they ever did. But now, with ships advancing toward their worlds, the Concordat faced a terrible choice. Delegate of the changed colors rapidly, expressing distress. Asking the humans for help would mean admitting that civilization itself had failed. It would mean embracing the very thing they had spent 11,000 years rejecting. It would mean inviting predators into their garden. Delegate Eth responded calmly. Would they rather die civilized than live with human help? The vote was close. 9 species voted in favor of contacting humanity, 6 voted against, 2 abstained. The decision was made. A message was sent to Earth. Admiral Ware received the transmission aboard the carrier Defiant. She was 53 years old, with gray streaks in her black hair and scars on her hands from decades of service. She had joined the United Earth Defense Force at 18. She had risen through the ranks through skill, determination, and a talent for leadership that her superiors found impossible to ignore. Now she commanded the Third Fleet, humanity's largest military formation. She read the Concordat's message 3 times, then she read it again. The same species who had called humanity primitive, the same species who had rejected Earth's membership applications with barely concealed disgust, the same species who had looked down upon human history with horror and judgment. Now they were asking for help. No, they were begging for it. Admiral called her senior officers to the briefing room. She showed them the message. She showed them the footage of Ambassador Saren's execution. She showed them the tactical data on the fleet. Captain, her second in command, leaned back in his chair. The Concordat had treated humanity like dangerous animals for 200 years. Now they wanted those animals to save them. Commander-Chief of Fleet Operations studied the tactical data. 800 enemy vessels, unknown weapons capabilities, unknown defensive systems. It would be a difficult fight. Admiral looked around the table at her officers. She saw anger in some faces, satisfaction in others. The Concordat had hurt humanity's pride. They had made Earth feel small and backwards. Part of her wanted to ignore the message. Let the civilized species deal with their own problems. But then she thought about 300,000 innocent people waiting to be enslaved or killed. She thought about all the other worlds in this path. She thought about what would happen if these conquerors were allowed to sweep across the galaxy unopposed. Humanity had spent its existence fighting nature, fighting each other, fighting to survive in a universe that did not care whether they lived or died. It was not something to be proud of exactly, but it was something they were good at. Admiral made her decision. Within 72 hours, the United Earth Defense Force began mobilizing. The Third Fleet would depart first, followed by the 1st and 5th. Ground forces were put on alert. Supply lines were established. The great machinery of human warfare, dormant for decades, roared back to life. Messages were sent to the Concordat. Humanity was coming. On worlds across the galaxy, civilized beings watched their screens with a mixture of hope and fear. They saw human warships preparing for departure. They saw human soldiers checking weapons and loading equipment. They saw a species that had never truly stopped preparing for war. They continued their advance, unaware of what was coming. They had conquered dozens of species. They had never faced real resistance. They expected the same easy victory they always achieved. They did not know about humanity. They did not know about human history. They did not know that the creatures coming to meet them had spent millions of years learning to kill, had refined violence into an art form, had survived extinction-level events through sheer stubborn refusal to die. The stellar savages were entering the war, and nothing would be the same again. Part 2. The Third Fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. 240 vessels dropped into normal space in perfect formation, their drives glowing blue against the black void. At the center of the formation sat the carrier Defiant, Admiral Wace's flagship, surrounded by destroyers and cruisers and support ships. Ahead of them the fleet waited, 800 vessels arranged in neat rows exactly as they had been positioned for the past week. The commanders had expected the Concordat to surrender. They had expected another easy conquest. They had not expected this. Admiral stood on the Defiant's command deck, studying the tactical display. The enemy fleet outnumbered her 3-1. Their ships were larger, more heavily armored. By any reasonable military calculation, humanity should not be able to win this fight. She smiled. Captain approached her station. They were hailing them. They were demanding identification. Admiral nodded, put them through. The main screen flickered to life. A commander appeared, its compound eyes gleaming, its mandibles clicking with what might have been amusement or contempt. It spoke in a harsh, grating language that the ship's computers translated instantly. Unknown vessels, you have entered territory. Identify yourselves and prepare for inspection. Resistance will result in destruction. Admiral straightened her uniform. She spoke clearly, knowing her words would be translated. This is Admiral Way of the United Earth Defense Force. We are here on behalf of the Galactic Concordat. You will withdraw from this system immediately. You will release any prisoners you have taken. You will return to your own space and never threaten Concordat worlds again. The commander's mandibles clicked faster. Its compound eyes seemed to darken. For a long moment, it simply stared at her through the screen. Then it laughed. At least that was what the translation suggested. A harsh, rattling sound that might have been amusement. Small creatures, soft creatures, you threaten us. We have conquered 100 worlds. We have crushed species far more powerful than yours. Your fleet is nothing. You are nothing. Admiral did not respond to the insult. She simply nodded once. You have been warned. She cut the transmission. On the Defiant's tactical display, the fleet began to move. They advanced in rigid formation, exactly as they always did. Their tactics had worked against every species they had encountered. Why change what worked? Admiral issued her orders calmly. All ships, execute pattern Delta 7. Fighters launch in 30 seconds. Across the human fleet, crews moved to battle stations. Fighter pilots climbed into their cockpits. Gunners powered up weapons that had not been fired in anger for a generation. Engineers monitored power systems and prepared for damage control. They expected the humans to form their own rigid line. They expected a straightforward exchange of fire. They expected their superior numbers to win the day. What they got was chaos. Human ships scattered in every direction. They broke formation, spinning and diving and accelerating on random vectors. To the tactical officers, it looked like panic. It looked like the humans were fleeing in terror. They were wrong. Pattern Delta 7 was a maneuver developed during Earth's Fourth World War, 200 years ago. It was designed to confuse superior forces, to make it impossible for enemies to concentrate their fire. The apparent randomness was actually precisely calculated. Each ship knew exactly where it needed to be and when. Human fighters streaked toward the fleet in waves. They were small and fast, difficult to track. The point defense systems tried to target them, but there were too many, coming from too many directions. Missiles launched from the fighters, slamming into ships before they could react. The first enemy vessel exploded. Then the second, the third, the 10th. The human cruisers regrouped and struck from the flanks. They appeared out of the scattered formation, fired concentrated volleys, and disappeared again before they could return fire. The enemy fleet tried to turn to face them, but they were already gone, only to reappear on the opposite side. Admiral watched the battle unfold on her display. Her face showed no emotion. She had studied the tactics from the intelligence gathered at 7. She had identified their weaknesses. They were powerful, yes. They were numerous, yes, but they were predictable. They had never faced an enemy that did not play by their rules. They did not know how to respond to an opponent who refused to stand and fight. Every time they formed a defensive position, the humans hit them from a new angle. Every time they tried to pursue, the humans led them into ambushes. Hours passed. The fleet began to shrink. By the 6th hour of battle, the commanders were in open panic. Their communications, intercepted and translated by human ships, revealed confusion and fear. This was not how war was supposed to work. This was not how enemies were supposed to behave. The soft creatures were supposed to be weak. They were supposed to die easily. Instead, they were winning. Admiral ordered the final phase of the attack. Human ships converged from all directions at once, a coordinated assault that struck the remaining vessels simultaneously. The enemy flagship, where the commander who had laughed at her still sat, took 17 direct hits in under 30 seconds. It broke apart in a shower of debris. The Battle of 7 lasted 19 hours. When it was over, 600 ships had been destroyed. The remaining 200 fled into faster-than-light travel, running back toward their home space. Human losses totaled 43 vessels. On worlds across the Concordat, beings watched the battle footage in silence. They had seen violence before in historical records and educational materials. But this was different. This was real. This was happening now. And the creatures doing the fighting, the ones winning so decisively, were the same species they had rejected as primitive savages. The Council reviewed the tactical data with something approaching awe. Human commanders had anticipated enemy movements before they happened. Human pilots had performed maneuvers that should have been impossible. Human soldiers had accepted death to protect their comrades, sacrificing themselves without hesitation. Delegate Eth spoke quietly to the assembled council. They had been right to fear humanity. They had been right to keep them at a distance. But perhaps they had not understood the full picture. Humans were not simply violent. They were effective. They had taken their capacity for destruction and refined it into something terrible and beautiful. They had made war into an art. And now that art was being used to save the Concordat. In the weeks that followed, more human fleets arrived. The First Fleet, the Fifth Fleet, ground forces for the liberation of occupied worlds, supply ships and medical vessels and engineering teams to rebuild what had been destroyed. Admiral established a forward command base at 7. She met with Concordat representatives who looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and terror. They thanked her for saving them. They asked, carefully, what humanity expected in return. Admiral told them the truth. Humanity expected nothing. They had come because innocent people were in danger. They had come because it was the right thing to do. The Concordat delegates did not entirely believe her. Nothing was ever free. There was always a price. But for now, they had no choice but to accept human help. The still held dozens of systems. The war was just beginning. Human ships continued to push forward, deeper into enemy territory. And everywhere they went, they found species that had been conquered and enslaved. They found worlds that had been stripped of resources. They found the true scope of the hegemony's cruelty. General, commander of the ground forces, led the liberation of the first enslaved world. His soldiers found hundreds of thousands of beings living in camps, worked nearly to death, fed barely enough to survive. The had treated them worse than animals. When the slaves saw the human soldiers, they did not know what to think. These new creatures were soft and strange. They carried weapons but they used them differently. They used them to break chains. They used them to set prisoners free. For the first time in generations, the slaves felt hope. The war continued. Battle by battle, system by system, humanity pushed the back toward their home space. Each victory was harder than the last. They learned from their defeats. They adapted their tactics. They fought with the desperation of a species facing extinction. But humanity had been fighting for millions of years. They had learned every lesson war could teach, and they did not stop. They never stopped. Part 3. 3 years after the Battle of Seven, the hegemony surrendered. General accepted the formal submission aboard his flagship, the Retribution. The last High Commander knelt before him, mandibles clicking in a sound the translators identified as grief. Its compound eyes had lost their shine. Its shell was cracked, and from battles it had barely survived. The war had cost them everything. Their fleets were destroyed. Their conquered systems had been liberated. Their home cluster was surrounded by human vessels. They had finally learned the lesson they had taught so many others. Sometimes the predator becomes the prey. General read the terms of surrender. They were harsh. They would disarm completely. They would pay reparations to every species they had enslaved. They would submit to monitoring by human forces for 100 years. They would never again build weapons of war. The High Commander accepted every term. It had no choice. Across the galaxy, beings celebrated. The great threat had been defeated. The conquerors had been conquered. For the first time in years, there was peace. But peace, as humanity had learned long ago, never lasted. The Galactic Concordat had existed for 11,000 years because its members had agreed to a set of rules. No military forces, no territorial expansion, no violence of any kind. These rules had worked because everyone followed them. They had worked because no one had reason to break them. Now everything had changed. They were the first to approach Earth with a proposal. They wanted a protection agreement. They would provide resources and technology in exchange for human military guarantees. If anyone threatened them, humanity would come to their defense. Admiral, now commanding the largest military force in known space, listened to their offer carefully. She understood what they were really asking. They wanted to buy safety. They wanted human soldiers to be their shield. Other species followed with similar proposals. They offered ancient technologies in exchange for defense treaties. A minor species on the galactic rim requested human troops to be stationed on their worlds permanently. Even the most prestigious members of the Concordat began quiet discussions about special arrangements with Earth. The Concordat Council watched these developments with growing alarm. Their system was based on equality. No species was supposed to have more power than any other. But now, one species clearly did have more power, much more. Some council members argued that humanity should be brought into the Concordat immediately. Make them full members. Give them a voice in governance. Perhaps that would balance their military strength with diplomatic responsibilities. Others disagreed. Humans had proven what they were capable of. They had shown their true nature during the war. Violence was in their blood. Giving them political power as well as military power would only make things worse. While the Concordat debated, other things were happening across the galaxy. The species known for their pacifist philosophy began secretly developing weapons. They studied human battle tactics. They built ships designed for combat rather than trade. When other species discovered this, they explained simply. The had appeared without warning. What if another threat emerged? What if the humans were not there to save them? What if the humans themselves became a threat? Other species reached the same conclusion. Within a year of the war's end, 7 different Concordat members had begun military programs. Weapons that had not existed for were being designed and built. Soldiers were being trained. Peaceful civilizations were remembering how to fight. Border disputes that had been settled through arbitration for centuries suddenly became tense. The Enda had argued about a mineral-rich asteroid field for 800 years. They had always resolved their disagreements through negotiation. Now, both species stationed armed ships near the disputed region. Negotiations became harder. Accusations became sharper. Delegate Eth of the addressed the council in emergency session. What they had built over 11,000 years was crumbling. The system depended on trust, on shared values, on the belief that violence was never acceptable. But now, species no longer trusted each other. They trusted weapons. And they trusted humanity most of all. Admiral received delegations from 16 different species in a single day. Each wanted something different: protection, alliance, technology transfers, trade agreements, promises of military support. Each looked at her with a combination of gratitude and fear. She understood, finally, what the Concordat had understood about humanity from the beginning, why they had kept Earth at arm's length, why they had feared the young species from the galactic rim. Humans were not builders of order, they were survivors of chaos. Human history was not a story of steady progress toward civilization. It was a story of crisis after crisis, war after war, disaster after disaster. Humans had survived ice ages and plagues and nuclear weapons. They had killed each other by the millions and somehow continued to exist. They had looked into the abyss of extinction and refused to fall. This made them strong. It made them resilient. It made them the perfect warriors to face the. But it also made them dangerous in a different way. They brought chaos with them wherever they went, not intentionally, not maliciously. It was simply their nature. They could not exist in a peaceful garden without eventually disturbing the soil. The Concordat had been a garden, carefully tended, beautifully maintained. And now human footprints were everywhere and nothing would grow the same way again. On Earth, the reaction to victory was complicated. Some humans wanted to return to their corner of space. They had done what was asked. They had saved the Concordat. Now they could go home and continue their patient development until the galaxy was ready to accept them as equals. Others saw things differently. The war had proven that humanity was not inferior to the older species. They were stronger, more capable, better prepared for the reality of a dangerous universe. Why should they pretend to be students when they had already become masters? General retired from military service. He had seen enough killing to last several lifetimes. He wrote in his memoirs that the war had been necessary but not good. They had saved innocent lives and destroyed an evil empire, but they had also reminded the galaxy what violence could accomplish. They had made war acceptable again. He did not know if that was worth celebrating. Admiral remained in command of human forces for another decade. She watched the Concordat slowly transform into something different. The old system of consensus gave way to a new system of alliances. Species grouped themselves around major powers, primarily humanity. Disputes were settled through negotiation backed by the threat of military force. It was not the peaceful garden that had existed before, but it was not chaos either. It was something in between, something messier and more complicated, something more human. The last time addressed the Concordat Council, she spoke about what humanity had learned during the war. They had learned that the galaxy was more dangerous than anyone wanted to believe. They had learned that peace required the ability to make war. They had learned that good intentions were not enough. But they had also learned something else. In the darkest moments of the conflict, when casualties were high and victory seemed uncertain, human soldiers had fought not for territory or resources. They had fought for strangers, species they had never met, beings who had treated them with contempt. They had fought because it was right, because someone had to. That was the thing about humans, said. They were capable of terrible violence, but they were also capable of terrible sacrifice. The two were connected. The same thing that made them dangerous also made them willing to die for others. The council listened in silence. 50 years after the war, the Galactic Concordat voted to dissolve itself. The old system no longer matched reality. In its place, a new organization emerged, the Galactic Assembly. Humanity was a founding member, with full voting rights and permanent representation. The first speaker of the assembly was a human. She stood before delegates from 30 different species and spoke about the future. Not a future of perfect peace, not a future without conflict, but a future where different kinds of beings could work together, could compromise, could build something better than any of them could build alone. It was not the galaxy the Concordat had dreamed of. It was messier, more complicated, more difficult. But it was real. On distant worlds, in systems that had once belonged to the hegemony, beings who had been slaves now built new lives. They named their children after human soldiers who had freed them. They celebrated Liberation Day each year, remembering when strange, soft creatures had appeared from the sky and broken their chains. They did not understand everything about their saviors. They did not know the full history of human violence and war. They only knew what humans had done for them. And that was enough. The stellar savages had entered the war. Order had collapsed, and from the ruins of the old galaxy, something new had emerged. Something that had room for both peace and strength. Something that accepted the darkness in intelligent beings while still reaching for the light. Something human.